Good morning and welcome. I'm Jan De Silva, President and CEO of Toronto Region Board of Trade. Who says you can't run a breakfast event on a Friday morning in July in Toronto? Obviously, we've been proven incorrectly. We're delighted to welcome you this morning to a very special discussion with Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, and the Honourable Catherine McKenna, Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Since her appointment last fall, Minister McKenna has been speaking with businesses and citizens from coast to coast. We're honored to have her share her insights with us today. And of course, in his previous role at the Bank of Canada, Governor Carney's calm and steady hand helped guide our country and arguably the global financial system on the heels of the global financial crisis. The world again is looking to him as we face uncertainty in the wake of Brexit, but we know from experience that we're in great hands. This morning, the Minister and Governor will discuss the implications of climate change initiatives for the financial sector in Canada and worldwide. For some in the room, it may take a moment to make the connection between climate change and financial markets. Last fall, the Governor eloquently made the connection in a speech to Lloyd's of London, so please allow me to paraphrase. The insurance industry is focused on new classes of risk in new parts of the world and in a climate as challenging as any as we've seen. The need to manage these risks is critical. There is technological risk, like cybersecurity, political risk to manage, and we can't ignore the elephants in the room being Brexit and the US election. And of course, a changing climate. And he said, and I quote, "Shifts in our climate bring potentially profound implications for insurers, financial stability, and the economy," end quote. Climate change presents one of the most substantial challenges to our world. It's one that will directly impact our country and our economy. As the Insurance Bureau of Canada said at our podium in 2012, Hurricane Sandy was a vivid reminder of the growing pressures that our local infrastructure must now withstand. The Canadian insurance industry has seen its costs multiply as a result of infrastructure that was never designed for today's environment, end quote. And it's not just the insurance industry that's taking notice. An in-depth analysis of the economic costs and opportunities of climate change conducted by the World Bank concludes that early action to reduce the impact of greenhouse gas emissions would only cost 2% of GDP. But it warns that delaying action will result in much higher economic costs, up to 20% of GDP. And with a third of global equity and fixed income assets invested in carbon-heavy companies, global climate agreements are altering fossil fuel economics, which could impact pension, mutual funds, government, and business assets. It's clear these are no small issues. So we're delighted to have the two leading authorities with us this morning to help us navigate through this discussion. We'll hear from them both in a moment, but before we begin, a show of hands to our Board of Trade members in the room here this morning. Very warm welcome to you, and an equally warm welcome to all the potential Board of Trade members joining us. The board is the most powerful mix of the Toronto Region's business community. All events and activities at the board are generously supported by our principal sponsors. Our thanks to Rogers, Scotiabank, Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University, and the Globe and Mail for supporting us in such a meaningful way. A round of applause, please. And a special thanks to Scotiabank, our International Finance Series sponsors, and today's supporting sponsor, CPA Ontario, with our past CEO of the board, Carol Wilding, leading the charge there, Rogers, and TD Bank. Some applause for them as well, please. We have some special guests joining us at our principal table. Please hold your applause until the entire table has been introduced, and could each guest please stand as I call your name. The Honourable Elizabeth Doddswell, Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. Jean-François Perrault, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist, Scotiabank. Carol Wilding, FCPA, FCA President and CEO, CPA Ontario. Darren Nippard, Partner Consulting, Deloitte, and Vice Chair of the Toronto Region Board of Trade's Board of Directors. Kevin McGurgan, British Consul General, Toronto. Glenn Mowat, Vice President of Central Commercial Sales, Rogers. Karen Clark Whistler, Chief Environment Officer, TD Bank Group. And our very special guest, the Honourable Catherine McKenna, Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England. Your principal table, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. A very special welcome as well to Diane Brisbois, President and CEO, Retail Council of Canada, member of our Board of Directors, Raj Katari, GTA Managing Partner, PwC, and a member of our Board of Directors, Lloyd Switzer, SVP Network Transformation, TELUS, and a member of the Board, Dave McFadden, past Chair of the Board, Peter Hermant, past Chair of our Board, Aaron O'Toole, MP Durham, Arthur Potts, MPP for Beaches East York and Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Toronto Councillor John Burnside, and the many former elected members of government and members of our policy committee. Could you please quickly stand for some recognition from the audience? Thank you. Now, to get our discussion started and introduce Minister McKenna, it's my pleasure to introduce Jean-François Perrault, SVP and Chief Economist at Scotiabank. He provides the bank's senior leaders, shareholders, and customers with economic information they need to make smart financial decisions. He came to Scotiabank from the Department of Finance, which he joined in 2009. He also held positions at the Bank of Canada, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. As you might expect, he worked with Governor Carney in a number of positions over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jean-François to the podium.
Thank you, Jan, for that very kind introduction, and thanks to the entire team of the Toronto Board of Trade for what I'm sure is going to be a fantastic event. So obviously I'm delighted to be here, both in a personal capacity and as a Scotiabanker. And Scotiabank is obviously incredibly proud to be sponsoring or co-sponsoring this event with the other sponsors today. Let me begin by extending a special welcome to the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, and also greetings to Governor Carney, who, as Jan said, I've had the privilege of working with a few times over the years, and it's always been a privilege. I mean, just a quick word. I mean, clearly, we know that you're an incredibly busy person, given what's going on in I'm not sure if it's your country or not, the country you're working in. Oh, I got it. There you go. Diplomatic incident. Perfect. But I think I'm assuming, and I think I'm right here, that your presence here is a testament, I think, to the importance you attach to these kinds of issues, and I think we're very delighted to have you here. It's also my pleasure to introduce another one of our special guests, Canada's Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, the Honourable Catherine McKenna. Before I invite her up to the podium, let me say this, that Canada's natural heritage matters to all Canadians. Matters to me. I'm sure it matters to everybody in the room as well, and I'll extend out to all Canadians, working in all sectors, including the financial sector, and we all have a role to play in protecting and conserving our environment. As a Canadian, I'm very proud that our great country has some of the strongest environmental protections in the world, and this will continue to be so under the leadership of Minister McKenna, who only days after being sworn into cabinet attended the Climate Change Summit in Paris, a testament to her commitment to environmental stewardship here in Canada and around the world. So we are privileged to have her and Governor Carney here today to speak about the ways that the government and the financial sector can work together to address climate change. And as you'll hear, one of the ways we can do that is through carbon pricing. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome me in joining to the podium the Honourable Catherine McKenna.
Wow, well, we've got quite the audience here. It's really nice they've all come to see me, Mark.
Yeah. I did come to see you,
You
Catherine.
did.
I just didn't
That's
know
right.
that you were going to bring a few friends.
Yeah, that's nice of you to bring a few friends.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jean-François. It's been a pleasure working with you. I want to thank the Toronto Board of Trade, all of you working so hard. A special shout out to Elizabeth Dodswell, who not only is the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, also was an ADM a while ago at Environment and Climate Change. Well, then it was just Environment Canada, now Environment and Climate Change Canada. I want to start by recognizing that we're on the traditional territory of many First Nations, now the Mississaugas of New Credit, and I think that's really important. I was just speaking at the Assembly of First Nations. I was also spent my family vacation in Haida Gwaii, and then was most recently in the Northwest Territories, which I know that's where you were born, and you have a special attachment to the Northwest Territories. And while we're seeing the impacts of climate change across the country with extreme weather events, Prince Edward Island is actually receding by 43 centimeters a year. Nowhere are we seeing the impacts of climate change more than in the north. It is very worrying. I was talking to Indigenous leaders there, Northerners, and they were talking about ice roads melting. So that means that communities are unable to reach each other. It's harder to get goods there. We're seeing hunting and fishing being much harder. That you are seeing the country food that people are relying on is no longer there. You're seeing an increase of species at risk. You're seeing invasive species. And it's not just an inconvenience, folks. It's a change in the way in life that we're seeing. And so it is really important that when we talk about climate change, we recognize that it really is the challenge of our generation, and we only have this generation to tackle this challenge. But I'm not here to talk about the moral challenge. We're here to talk about you and the financial sector, and both the risks and also the opportunities when it comes to climate change. When we talk about the risks, we've seen extreme weather events. Now, while it's very difficult to attribute a particular event to climate change, when you look at the forest fires in Fort McMurray, $3.65 billion, or over $3 billion is what we're now saying the cost was. And when the Insurance Bureau of Canada is saying we're only going to see more extreme weather events as we go forward. But there's also a huge opportunity, and we'll talk about that as well. When we were in Paris at the climate talks, one of the untold stories was Mission Innovation, where you had billionaire philanthropists like Bill Gates who are talking about the need for huge investments in renewables and clean tech sector so that we could meet the challenges of climate change. But billionaires like Bill Gates don't just do these things for fun. There's absolutely huge economic opportunity, and we want to see Canada be part of that opportunity. So what have we been doing? I'll use this little opportunity before we get into our conversation to show that we are serious about climate change. Because I think government signals are important. We'll talk about market signals. But you have a government that is absolutely committed to acting on climate change and showing that the environment and the economy do go together. So Paris climate talks, we worked very hard to get an ambitious agreement. We were there not just with premiers. We were there with members of the opposition. We were there with business. We were there with Indigenous leaders. We were there with environmentalists. We were there with youth. And I think that's really important because everyone has to be in this together. Some people are leading. Some of you in the room are leading. Some of you might be in the laggards category. But I'm going to drag all of you along because we are serious about tackling climate change. After Paris, there was the meeting between the Prime Minister and the First Ministers where they agreed that we needed to have a plan to meet our target. So our target, and I don't think Canadians care as much about targets as they do about action, but I think our target is important because we agreed, the previous government agreed that we would reduce emissions by 30% over 2005 levels by 2030. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is currently this is the direction our emissions are going, and this is the directions our emissions need to be going. So we got a lot of work to do. We've already started. We've made in our budget, I think it's really the greenest budget ever, making significant investments in green infrastructure, but also public transit. Even social infrastructure is going to be energy efficient, climate resilient investments. Investments in innovation in the clean tech sector, but also in the natural resource sector so that we can reduce emissions from that sector as well. Across our budget, you will see that we are very serious about how we're going to transition to a more sustainable future. We had the meeting with President Obama. The big outcome from that meeting was our agreement on climate and clean energy. Part of that reducing emissions from the oil and gas sector by 45%, 40 to 45%, which is actually like taking all the cars off the road in Ontario and Quebec. We then extended that agreement to Mexico most recently. And now we're engaged in our what we're calling the Pan-Canadian Climate Change Plan, which is really cumbersome. Basically, it's how are we moving forward on this? What's the plan? Certainly carbon pricing is going to be part of that plan. We've talked about a national price on carbon, and I'm very excited that later today, I think we are up to 22 companies that have signed on to our carbon pricing leadership initiative, joining companies and governments around the world calling for a price on carbon. I think that's extraordinarily important. But we have working groups that are looking at technical areas like how do you reduce emissions from the oil and gas sector, from buildings, from vehicles, from agriculture, forestry, where we know are the major buckets emissions are coming from. We're also looking at adaptation. That's going to be key. We need to make sure we have climate resilient infrastructure. We need to be addressing the changes we're already seeing in communities across the country. And then equally important is the working group that's on clean tech jobs and innovation, because that's piece of this. That this is really a huge economic opportunity, but we really need to be thoughtful about how we move forward and make sure it is an opportunity and that everyone's benefiting, even though there may be a transition for some. And I should say, just because I know, just so you don't think that I'm alone, because people like environment ministers, but you guys probably like finance ministers more. I work extremely closely with Bill Morneau. He and I are leading the working group, ultimately leading from the federal side the working group on carbon pricing. And I think that's really important. That should provide you with some confidence, but it should show that we're all in on this. So that's enough about what we're doing, because as I said, I think people are probably here to see you, Mark. So I don't have to go through Mark's list of achievements. Obviously all of you would know him previously as the Governor of the Bank of Canada, now Governor of the Bank of England, Chairman of the Financial Stability Board. I could go on and on. When I was trying to have an interesting fact, I found out that he ran the 2015 London Marathon in 3.5 hours. But so that's amazing on its own. But okay, you can pay me now.
Yeah, that's good. I supplied that interesting fact.
But what's amazing?
Everyone put down their smartphones. No Googling allowed. Double check that.
What's amazing about that is that's actually faster than he ran in Ottawa. So, what, do you got a lot of time on your hands or something? Someone who grew up in Canada, in the Northwest Territories, passionate about our country. I'm just so honored that you're here. You're a good friend to be making the trek. And I think I'll just lead off by asking, so why are you here?
Exactly. Well, I'm here, the honest answer is I'm here to visit my brother.
What?
And his family, and this sort of irresistible force found out about it and said, literally, let's have this small conversation about climate and what the Financial Stability Board is doing and how it intersects with financial markets. And Jan and others grew it into this, and I would like to thank people because it's a beautiful day. It is, let's be honest, it's Friday in Toronto. It's a beautiful day. You all have other things you could be doing much nicer than this. And so it's a testament to all of you for taking the time, and so thank you for having me. Why is the central bank governor and why are financial regulators looking at climate? The reason is that last year the G20 asked us to. They asked the Financial Stability Board, which I chair, as you mentioned, to address the risks that come from climate change for the financial sector. And I'll answer it this way. The way we look at it as regulators, including as the Bank of England, is threefold. First, there's the actual physical damage that comes from climate events. And I'll put some context on that. We regulate, as the Bank of England, we regulate the third largest insurance industry in the world, including Lloyd's of London, so one of the biggest pools of reinsurance in the world. And whether you're in property and casualty or reinsurance, and even in the life sector because of the asset side of the balance sheet, you're on top of these issues. You're aware, if you're at Lloyd's, that the number of extreme weather events has gone up threefold since the 1980s. The cost of that has gone up fivefold in terms of claims paid. And that's at a time when actually coverage is being pulled in at the same time in terms of responding to the shift in climate. So there's the actual physical cost. It's mostly manifest in the insurance sector, in the financial sector. The second issue, which we probably won't spend too much time on, but is a lurking issue, which is around liability. Think director's liability, think corporate liability, think asbestos as an example. When did you know, and with a reasonable degree of certainty about the potential damages of activities of your company, and what did you do about it? And that liability accretes over time, and it is a real question of transition. We're seeing the first cases, those who reinsure, those who insure directors, those who insure companies against these issues are starting to become much more focused. And again, in the UK, we're seeing some of the cutting edge on that. The third issue is perhaps the most general one, which is around transition. And this is the risk that financial markets adjust abruptly to climate risk. And I'll give it, and there's a variety of ways this can manifest. We've seen some in the past with German utilities, for example. New climate legislation came in place in Germany. Effectively, the market thought that it would be repealed until it wasn't. Very sharp adjustment in equity values as a consequence of that. You sometimes see it with extreme physical events. But more broadly, there's this question of over what time path will there be carbon pricing on a more global scale? Will various frameworks and other things begin to bite? And how does the market adjust? And from a financial regulator perspective, the issue we have is that investors, credit providers, management, other stakeholders can't make assessments today about how well prepared companies are for that transition. I'll stop with this fact. We have looked at the top 1,000 companies by market cap in the world. Only a third of them give effective carbon disclosure, climate disclosure. A lot of them give some form of disclosure or boilerplate risk language, but they don't give the type of disclosure you need as an investor or a credit provider to figure out who's on top of this, who's thinking ahead, who isn't. I said that was going to be the last point. This is the last fact I'll make on this, but make one other point.
That's a sub.
That's a sub last point.
That's good.
You're going to see this behavior quite frequently during this. Jean-Francois knows this. It's part of the privilege of working with me, Jean. I never. I should have control over my own introductions. That could have gone anywhere. That whole country thing. Anyways, what's important from our perspective is that there's a market in transition, because different investors, different credit providers, different companies, individual stakeholders will have different views about the seriousness of the issue. Candidly, they will have different views about the credibility of governments in terms of taking action. They will have different views, degrees of optimism or pessimism about new technologies which could address the issue. And so you want a market. We want to be neutral, if you will, create the information set out there so that all of those views can be expressed in a market that is an efficient market that doesn't have a sort of climate Minsky moment, if I can use the thing that keeps central bankers up at night is a sort of sudden change in risk. We saw that in 2007-8. We've had risk of it in recent years, and we don't want to have one around climate.
Great. That's it.
That's it for this subclause of my answer.
So let's talk a bit about what you call the physical risk. So as I said, we're seeing extreme weather events at the federal government level. We worry about this. We now, the Parliamentary Budget Office has talked about $1 billion per year is the expected cost to the federal government to cover claims, although as we've seen, it's really, sometimes it can be a lot higher, and who knows what direction we're going. Do you think that, well, we tend to be cautious, I would say, in Canada, but that we're actually being reckless when it comes to estimating the risk and making sure that we're actually insuring properly for it?
Well, I think it's hard for me, McKenna, to comment specifically about Canada. I just don't have the information in terms of how quickly models are adjusting and coverage. I mean, I would say by reputation, the Canadian, certainly insurance industry, it was fine when I was here. Tiff Macklin's here. When we were doing this stuff, it was fine. You guys, it's only been 3 years. I don't know what. No. Steve, Osfi, Jeremy Rudin's on top of it, I assure you. But what has happened? So you look at Sandy. You referenced, I think, Hurricane Sandy, which we all remember a few years ago in New York. The cost of Sandy was probably about 30% higher because of that 2 centimeter increase in the level of the water around New York. Now, the good news is that, at least from a Lloyd's of London perspective, is that those who'd reinsured some of those risks had figured out that tail risk. And since they managed to a 1 in 200 event, they start building in these more extreme events in the tail, which is what they have to do. But it does mean that these premiums are going up. It does mean the coverage is being adjusted. And past is not prologue in the insurance industry. That's what they have figured out, and they really are on top of it. But it hasn't come into the broader financial consciousness yet. And I'll make one other point on it, which is that even within the insurance industry, what we found, and there's a Bank of England report which is in the public domain on this, that there's a degree of cognitive dissonance in the insurance industry, by which I mean they can be quite good on the liability side managing these risks. So in other words, their premiums and what they underwrite and the term of the contract. But actually on the asset side, in terms of the real estate they hold, for example, is quite often increasingly exposed to these types of risks, and they haven't adjusted on the asset side to the extent they have on the liability side. And that's likely true for a broader swath of the financial sector that hasn't been thinking about, doesn't have to think immediately about the liability.
So something else in a recent speech you gave, you talked about, not about the tragedy of the commons, which I think actually with climate change, often people think of tragedy of the commons that, we're just Canada, everyone else is also emitting. But I think actually we've dealt with that to a certain extent in that 195 countries came together. Everyone recognized that we need to keep temperatures below 2 degrees. Every country has made commitments for the first time ever. And in the UN context, absolutely unprecedented. And we know we need to do better. So reporting back every 5 years. But you talk about the tragedy of the horizon, which I think is really interesting. And the fact that we're just not able to sort of think long-term down the road and make these adjustments so that we may end up just kind of keep on going. We might just end up going and then hitting this, what keeps you up at night, the Minsky moment. And that's why our government is so serious about that. I mean, we do not want that to happen. And so that's why we want a plan. We want a framework. We want something that's looking out 2030, but also 2050. But with all these guys, all these women, all these folks in the room here. I mean, what should the financial sector be doing to avoid this so-called Minsky moment?
Okay, well, so there was a lot in your question, and rightly so, because the issue from a financial regulator perspective, let's say as a bank regulator, we don't worry too much about climate risk today because the length of the loans that a bank gives, 5 years or under, most of those physical risks aren't going to manifest. And the pace of regulatory change and other change, climate policy, if you will is likely to have a gradual transition over that period. The problem is, so we're doing our job, and we're not going to try to do your job by internalizing climate risk before it's there. The problem is, as you know, that if you believe any of the sort of broad climate modeling, that of course it's less expensive for the economy as a whole to adjust early. And so the financial system doesn't immediately internalize those costs. It doesn't force adjustment. The weight is much more on government, as it should be. Once policy frameworks, though, are put in place, which is what's happening post-Paris and is what's happening with your PCCCP, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very sexy.
Yeah, that's good. You might want to.
Rebrand.
Probably someone in the room who could
All
work
right,
on a better
actually, someone
acronym.
here, government's not
Is it
good at
better in
rebranding.
French?
Someone can do that for free.
C'est
En
mieux-
français,
non,
je sais
mieux en
pas.
français,
Je ne
c'est-
sais pas en français.
Probablement. Papier.
Papier.
Yeah, there's no doubt. But the once you have those frameworks in place, then what this room, if you will, I'll use the room as representative, has to think about, okay, how well are individual companies, how are they affected by this? How are they adjusting to it? And then very importantly, is that framework sufficient for the 2030 goal? And is the 2030 goal itself sufficient for the broader goal? So Paris, as you know, the objective is 2 degrees. The stretch objective is 1.5. The actual commitments made in Paris, again, you were there, you negotiated this, and to your credit, and the credit of the other countries, is they came clean with what we have shown up with and agreed to. Even if we do all that, it will achieve 2.6 or 2.7, something like that. So we won't get our core goal, and we certainly won't get our stretch goal. And what that tells you is that more will ultimately have to be done. Okay. So if you accept all of that, which is there, if you have the information to make judgments about how well companies are adjusting to the framework that's coming in place in Canada, and if that framework is credible, and the global process is credible and is going to be reinforced over time, then some of that adjustment gets pulled forward. It's exactly, it's a stretched analogy that Jean-Francois and Tiff and maybe a handful of other people will get, but this is how monetary policy works. If the framework is credible, the knowledge that we're going to do things in the future affects behavior today. The knowledge that climate policy is real, that it's, to use the Canadian example, it's not just the federal government, it's all provincial governments as well, that there's tangible action, and that action will need to be reinforced over time. Once you've determined that what you're doing is working effectively, then a market will do what a market does best, which is to pull forward adjustment, reward winners, reward or punish losers, reinforce managements that are thinking in a forward sense. In jurisdictions where there are more of a framework, Europe as an example, this is much more mainstream. So you can sort of see where Canada will be headed. And if we can, and I hate to sort of hammer on the disclosure point, but it is incredibly important, if we can be successful, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about who the we is there, because it's not the public sector, it's the private sector, and there's a framework around this, and there's a few people in the room who are helping to drive it. If they can be successful in putting together that disclosure framework, it can make everyone in the room's job much easier.
So let's move into disclosure.
Okay.
So as the chair of the Financial Stability Board, you've taken on project at the behest of the G20 on corporate disclosure of carbon risk. So, I mean, I don't know, many in the room may not know much about the project. Maybe talk a little bit about the project, and maybe you could respond. So I did a roundtable with some members of the financial sector yesterday, and part of it came up. They said, like, look, we're always disclosing. Like, is this just, we're just going to have another, document where you got to, spend a ton of time, bunch of lawyers on it. So, what is this actually going to be useful? And then another question that came up, which is, I think a real question. What if you're the good corporate citizen that discloses? So right now you have some companies that actually are disclosing. An example was given. One company gave a great disclosure, really went into details about their risk. Another company in the same, in the energy sector, did kind of a crappy job, like just short disclosure. And the company, there was a feeling that the company that actually came clean and said, we have this risk. I mean, I'm sure, hopefully, they talked about how they're managing it, but they felt that they were then penalized. So, I mean, what are you trying to do with this? What kind of disclosures would be, and what's it going to be used for?
Okay, so there's various ways to cut into this. Let me start at the top, which is that I don't know if people read. Some of you would have read Larry Fink's letter to CEOs earlier this year, which basically asked them to disclose their strategies for long-term value creation. So what are the most important issues for long-term value creation? And BlackRock as an investor wants to see the top issues and a clear strategy and the metrics against which that strategy is executed. Part of the reason why Larry and others are on this push, and you can think of CPPIB as led in this area as well, maybe not as publicly prominently, but certainly an activity to all of our benefit, because I know my pension is coming from Canada, that's what has been, we're in, this is not news, we're in a very low interest rate, relatively low growth environment. And longer term strategy is going to be much more important for value creation. This is one of the issues that companies are going to have to, once you think medium to long term, this is an issue, it has to be addressed. That's the first sort of meta point I'd make. Second one, in terms of who is doing this. So the G20 asked, G20 leaders asked, we responded, we said disclosure is one of the most important issues. They said, you're right, go off and do something about it and come back to us in a year. So what we did is we've set up a private sector task force. It is all private sector. It's led by Mike Bloomberg, for another force of nature, absolutely. It has major corporates in it, so think BHP Billiton, Tata, Unilever as three examples. It has the major pools of capital in the world, from sovereign wealth funds from Singapore to our own CPPIB, to BlackRock, to a number of reinsurers, but a global footprint on that front. It has all the big four accounting firms, all the rating agencies, a number of banks, so the users of this information as well. And then it has experts in corporate disclosure. And this is a very pragmatic group of people. And I would really put the emphasis that it's those who are going to have to give the disclosure and those who are going to use it. So they're trying to figure out, from a materiality perspective, what's most useful. The first thing, obviously, is in a consistent, comparable, reliable way, what's your footprint? What are your emissions in a way that talks not just about probably the emissions of your actual activities, but your upstream power emissions. A Canadian advantage, I would, in a global sense, having both of those in there, given the overall energy mix in this country. That's not why it's there, but that would be the first element. But most importantly, what is your strategy for managing? So again, back to long-term value creation. What's your strategy for managing climate-related risks? How do you govern that? What's your risk management around these issues? And thinking that through in a way that is across major companies. They intend, their first report is out, it's in the public domain. They're intending to finish at the start of next year, which would roll into the G20 summit, the German G20 summit. It's not going to surprise you that this is, of interest in Germany, as it is. And if anyone is in any doubt, these issues are of paramount interest in China. Issues around climate, green. A substantial proportion of the Chinese G20 summit in September will be around climate issues, and we'll come into some of the opportunities maybe related to that, because I think there are several. So point being that there is a process, it's a private sector-led process, dominated process. It will deliver this disclosure recommendations, and then the question is, will there be take-up? If it's good, there'll be take-up. If it's good, there'll be demand for take-up by the investor community, by creditors, and that will help with the transition. The one other point I'd make on it is that we did something similar with the financial sector post-crisis, because effectively bank disclosure, a number of banks in the room, their required disclosure is pretty thick, and somebody wants every little bit of it, but it's not that effective in disclosing how they manage risk, how they make money, how they think about risk. So for the 30 largest banks in the world, they set up something called the Enhanced Disclosure Task Force. They figured out with their investors and rating agencies, et cetera, what the better disclosure would be. They put those proposals out. We endorsed them as the FSB and G20. This is about 5 years ago, and now 95% of them are implemented. And 28 of those 30 banks all give that disclosure. And you have a globally comparable disclosure set, which is actually useful. So there's a bit of that model being applied to, truth be told, a more complex task in climate.
So before we get into the opportunity, because I think it's really important we talk about that, you've talked about disclosure as one of the tools. Carbon pricing. Let's talk about carbon pricing, one of my favorite topics. I believe in the role of the markets. I fought hard in the Paris Agreement to get the text that recognized market mechanism. I'm formerly a trade and competition lawyer with the Bay Street firm. And we know that I would ask everyone to raise their hand that's with a company that has an internal price on carbon. We know many companies have an internal price on carbon already so that they can manage risk. And we know it's the most efficient way to reduce emissions and foster innovation. 80% of Canadians live or will live in a jurisdiction with a price on carbon. And internationally, there's a lot of discussion about this. As you say, China actually is going to have a cap and trade system coming into place next year. But maybe it's one thing for me to say this, and I see myself as an economic minister as much as an environment minister. But what's your pitch? Some people, just say, well, gosh, this is just another tax, bad tax. Why is there this discussion going on internationally about pricing carbon?
Well, so it's not, obviously it's not our responsibility. Yeah. It goes to a question of how the commitments governments have made and the societies behind those governments have made to address this issue, and what are the most effective instruments to do so. Obviously, pricing carbon internalizes an externality. That's the logic. There's a question how you develop that price. You could do it through a market mechanism, a cap and trade, or you could do it through by fiat, if you will, and provide that price and the adjustment. It is the cleanest way for a market to judge carbon exposure, the tangible implications of carbon exposure. It's also the cleanest way to think about the path of regulation and what's required to ultimately stabilize carbon emissions. And this is it's an obvious point, but I'll make it, which is actually making obvious points is a central banker's specialty, but so I'm making an obvious point. But made in a very serious way. I'm going to make an obvious point. But you have to, whatever degrees we end up at stabilizing, emissions have to be capped, right? They have to stabilize at some point, whether it's at 2, 2.5, 3, 4 degrees. And so the pricing of carbon has to, the effective price, whether it's done through absolute regulation or it's through a cap and trade system or a fiat price, has to accrete to a level that results in that. Again, from a market perspective, some would take a variety of regulation and other measures and map them into a synthetic price to determine the impact. It's easier if there is just a price, obviously. Now, I'm not making the judgment because there are between regulation, between quotas, and prices, technology funds. You need a variety. You know far better than I. You need a variety of mechanisms to address this risk. Why don't I'll leave it there.
So let's talk about the opportunity. So we've hopefully scared you enough. You need to act, get acting. But let's talk about the opportunity. So you and I sat on a stage in Washington not so long ago, and you talked about the $30 trillion opportunity that was China when it came to transitioning to a more sustainable future. So what's the pitch? I mean, why should we, why should, the financial sector, why should companies in Canada, why should venture capital funds, why should people be looking at this actually as an opportunity? And, the government has a role to play, so maybe what's the role of government? I've never been awesome at fostering innovation and productivity and stimulating the investment, but we certainly have a role, but what's the role of the financial sector?
Yeah, well, it's not so much a pitch, but what are some of the scale of investment that's going to happen, and what are the mechanisms that could be put in place so that investment is done as efficiently and effectively, and in fairness, profitably as possible. So, in terms of orders of magnitude of let's call it clean energy. Or lower carbon energy infrastructure, cleaner water, sanitation, et cetera, that would be put in place over the course of the next 15, 20 years, given increased urbanization, given brownfield, given policy frameworks that are being put in place, somewhere on the order of $5 to $7 trillion a year, US dollars a year. So, significant asset class, mainstream asset class. I think that's maybe something I should have said at the start. All of this has to be mainstream to make a difference. So it has to just be one of the factors that's considered. We're getting the hook. The second,
keep on going.
I was just about to get the opportunity. It's really good, and I just don't have time to say.
You don't want to go back to the UK anyway.
I do want to go back to the UK. To absolutely clear for the record. I do.
Okay.
So that order of magnitude of investment. The question is, how's that going to be financed? How much of that, and for this room, how much of that is going to be financed through capital markets? How much of that's going to be cross-border capital markets? And I'll give one example to make it tangible. So the Bank of England's been working with the People's Bank of China over the course of the last year and a half, on developing a green bond market in China. Now, that's a desire of the Chinese government. It's part of a much bigger set of initiatives. But the order of magnitude of issuance in China of capital market instruments for lower carbon, cleaner energy, sanitation, et cetera, is about $500 billion US dollars a year. Okay? All right. I don't know how many people who are part of the $100 trillion global institutional fixed income investor pool here, but there's some of them, right? How are your yields these days? They're not, how are your yields relative to the expectations of your, if you're an insurance company, your policyholders or a pension fund, your pensioners, or just your unit holders in a mutual fund. It won't surprise you that yields in China are considerably higher than those in Canada, the UK, elsewhere. It also won't surprise you if you have any dealings with the Chinese that they're keen to open up this market, they're keen to professionalize, and they think from a global perspective. So one of the initiatives of the G20 is to develop a global standard for this asset class, which has to be a mainstream standard. So it has to have the right dispute resolution mechanisms. It has to have the right terms and conditions. It has to have, validated whether it's, quote, green or not. That has to be a consistent asset class. But it has to be good enough to be in a mainstream portfolio. The Chinese, some of you will know, earlier this year removed restrictions, not just lessened them, but absolutely removed restrictions on institutional capital coming into long-term fixed income investment, which is related to this. So you've got a new market which is going to be created. It has potential to be $500 billion a year, high yielding, duration, directly related to your work, but also just an asset class that also should be of a standard of global fixed income markets, because one thing we know at the Bank of England is what those standards are, and how to organize a room so that we have the right people to make sure that what we think are those standards are those standards. And so that's something we'll have to look at, and that is a tangible opportunity. Now, I haven't touched on the cutting edge technology opportunities or the equity opportunities of others, but there's just a core mainstream fixed income opportunity around this that comes. Last point I'd make is that I actually think if we get this disclosure right, the relative value, and you do your job, and your counterparts around the world do your jobs, I'm confident you will, that the relative value opportunity that gets exposed by this in equities is pretty considerable. Who's leading, who's lagging, who has opportunity, low-hanging fruit to move forward, and that becomes one of the considerations, and which is positive for everybody, I think.
That's great. Well, so we've talked about the risks, we've talked about the opportunities. I should say that Minister Freeland and I have talked about the first ever trade mission to China with an environment minister and a trade minister, and I think that's showing how serious we are about making the case this is an opportunity and facilitating it. I don't know if it happened this year, it's a busy year, but hopefully this year or next year. Anyway, we're clearly getting the signal from Jen, but we're actually just going to be taken off the stage with one of those things. But I just, I want to thank you, Mark. I know that this audience, we could have had more people in this room.
One or two questions?
Yeah.
I just say it's leadership like yours standing up for really important issues. I know you've got your hat on as this is actually the smart thing to do, but coming back to Canada at a really busy time to talk to us here, it matters a lot to me, but I know that everyone in the room appreciates it. So thank you very much. And have a good visit with your brother too.
We have time for one question.
No. Very terrific discussion and lots to absorb. We'll have time for one or two questions. We've got staff with microphones. So if you want to put up your hand if you've got a question. We've got one at the front there. Could you introduce yourself, name and company? And
Sure. Toby Heaps with Corporate Knights. And I just, my grandfather was a member of the Can Loan program in the Second World War, where Canada lent people to the UK. So it's nice to see the program resurrected with central bankers. I had I have a question, but there's a sub-question in the theme of and the first question is, given everything that's going on in the world right now, Brexit, US presidential year with some interesting candidates, do you think it will still be possible to overcome the tragedy of the horizons in the same way that you may have thought it would have been possible a year ago? And then the second question, given that central banks now hold a diverse pool of assets in many cases way beyond sovereign bonds, way into equities and corporate bonds, do you think this financial disclosure will also apply to central banks in terms of climate risk?
Right. In terms of the first, I wouldn't get too caught up in the current headlines, and there are always issues on the plates of leaders, and of course the measure of those leaders is the ability to deal with the day-to-day and also look to the medium and long term. I think particularly with one of the many strengths of China is their perspective, their medium long-term perspective. This is an ambitious G20. It's an ambitious Chinese leadership. These issues, as I said earlier, Toby, are central to their priorities. The work that we're doing on disclosure and others just complements it. There's a lot else that's away from the so-called finance track of it, as you can appreciate. So I think this orientation is there. It'll stay. I obviously can't speak for the German presidency, which has not yet started. But given history, interest, and importance, one would expect that this will be picked up there as well. In terms of central bank disclosure, I mean, if we get better disclosure, it's easy just to flow through the disclosure that comes from the underlying entities. One of the interesting things will be, and there's some legislation in Europe, as you probably know, part of the Montreal Protocol, I think, goes to this as well, in terms of pools of capital, how well do they disclose their climate risk and the trajectory of that. I mean, I think in fairness to them, it's extremely difficult for them to do right now because you don't have it at source. And so let's deal with the issue at source, and then it flows through from there.
Very good. One final question.
Oh, fantastic.
Wow.
Yeah, it's good.
Questions.
Board
Very
into
good.
submission.
All right.
That's the way, classic.
Well, no,
It's the
Governor,
old-
I'm going to borrow something you said in humor about how it's the job of central bankers to say the obvious, but say it
Yeah.
very seriously. But I think there's a lot of parallels to the discussion this morning. I mean, this is a very, very real issue. We've got our government through the minister really stepping up to articulate what we're going to be doing from a policy perspective. But I think what you've done very effectively is help paint the picture for all of us on the financial implications this holds. It's heartening to hear that there's some pragmatic thinkers looking at disclosure, the whole introduction of a new global asset class, being green bonds, as one of the world's global financial centers. Let's hope Toronto can jump on that really quickly. But I want to thank you both, Minister, for bringing the topic to us today, very important, and to Governor Carney for helping us get grounded in why this is real and why we need to take action on this.